In the marketplace of Al-Ramtha, an elderly blind seer sat beside a flickering light in the middle of the wide Arabian desert, where the wind carried secrets from forgotten tombs. Like the rustle of old scrolls, his voice told stories that made even the most courageous men shudder. He muttered, "Beware the pact of blood," to a passing passenger. "For when three brothers swear upon the same blade, the sands shall drink their fate." Except for one, no one listened to the insane old man. The words caused a hooded figure to freeze, hands shaking as they gripped the dagger's hilt. His history was calling. He had attempted to hide his past under the sands. Jafar, Rashid, and Omar were three brothers who stood at the intersection of fate long ago in the once powerful city of Al-Ramtha, where the desert winds whispered mysteries of vanished civilizations. Though separated by ambition and bound by blood, their hearts were driven by a single desire: power. For many years, their father, Sheikh Adnan, a wise and ruthless ruler, had administered justice in Al-Ramtha. The city flourished during his reign, its walls standing firm against encroaching tribes, and its marketplaces teeming with traders from far-off places. However, his sons felt suffocated by the shadow of his rule. Unlike submissive heirs, they weren't satisfied to wait for inheritance. They yearned for power in order to leave their mark on history. The night that altered everything then arrived. When the sky bled like a wounded beast beneath the crimson brightness of an eclipse, the brothers fled into the desert. They reached the remains of an old temple, a location mentioned in frightful legends and deserted for years, after traversing shifting sands and lost trails. Its walls had been stripped naked by time, leaving only fading inscriptions that no scholar could decipher and collapsing pillars. However, something persisted deep within the temple's core. A knife rested on a stone altar, its blade etched with mysterious designs that glinted in the faint firelight, its hilt blackened with age. Such weapons, created in a time when men forged alliances with entities they could not comprehend, were mentioned in legends. The weight of fate was on it. It was no ordinary steel. The oldest Jafar moved forward. As he held out his palm over the dagger, his dark eyes, as keen as a falcon's, flickered with assurance. His steady, deep voice broke the dense silence. "We swear on this blade that at all costs, one of us will rule Al-Ramtha." As if the desert itself had noticed, a blast of wind howled through the temple remains. Omar and Rashid looked at each other, barely a brief moment of hesitancy before resolve replaced it. They laid their hands on the dagger one by one. The rest followed as Jafar drew the blade across his palm without saying a word. The metal was streaked with crimson as warm, viscous blood welled up. Their mixed blood trickled down the altar as their hands clasped together, a silent covenant, an unwavering vow to the desert. Time and betrayal could not sever the tie that was formed in that instant, under the watchful eye of the eclipsed moon. However, such oaths are not taken in vain. Furthermore, power is never given by the gods of the dunes for free. Sheikh Adnan was no idiot. For decades, he had dominated Al-Ramtha, outwitting adversaries inside and outside the city's boundaries. He had witnessed betrayers come and go, alliances change, and the desire for power corrupt even the most honorable people. He now witnessed the same ravenous hunger that had destroyed many before them in his own boys. He initially wrote it off as immature ambition, a fire that would be tempered by time. But he kept a closer eye on them as the months went by. They stared at his throne for too long. Their murmurs became more subdued. They were too far in the shadows. Instead of viewing him as a father figure, they now saw him as a barrier that prevented them from achieving the authority they so desperately desired. The elderly sheikh was becoming suspicious. Then came the fate-sealing night. Al-Ramtha was a hive of music and laughter during the harvest celebration. The aroma of sweet dates and grilled lamb filled the air as golden lanterns lined the streets. Nobles and merchants raised their goblets in celebration of the city's wealth during a lavish feast held in the palace under the warm glow of candles. Sheikh Adnan sat on his gilded seat at the head of the grand feast, his eyes silently, proudly scanning his people. In front of him, plates of luscious food shone in the candlelight. Perfectly seasoned meats, steaming saffron rice, and figs drenched in honey. He didn't eat, though. His son sat close to him, the careful mass of obedient heirs plastered on their features. The oldest, Jafar, spoke warmly, his words full of praise. but his fingers curled just a bit over his goblet, watching and waiting. Rashid's charm seemed effortless as he joked with the aristocrats, but his eyes kept going to his father's cup. The youngest Omar sat quietly, his lips drawn into a thin line, his shoulders stiff. The sheikh finally raised his goblet. As he raised it high, a toast to his people, his city, and his legacy, a resounding applause echoed through the hall. In the flickering torchlight, the wine inside glistened like rubies. However, something changed as soon as the liquid made contact with his lips. His throat was gripped by a jagged, unseen hand. The world became hazy. The golden lights became smudged. His veins began to burn with a horrible heat that came from within. His limbs resisted his attempts to stand and speak. His lips made a soundless wail, but it never materialized. Then there was silence. The red wine spilled like blood when the cup slipped out of his hand and hit the marble floor. The hall echoed with a gasp. Servants hurried up. Confusion gave way to terror in the voices. Al-Ramtha's ruler and protector of its citizens, the renowned Sheikh Adnan, had fallen. Jafar arrived at his father's dead body first. His hands shook. Anguish distorted his face. His sobs of sorrow were perfect. Nobody asked him any questions. Nobody noticed the glimmer of victory beneath his grief. The city was covered in mourning by daybreak, with his sons leading the burial procession with solemn faces and heads bowed in respect. The sheikh was buried with dignity. Unaware of the individuals who had shed their tears before them, the populace grieved for their departed leader. And there wasn't much discussion when it came time to choose a successor. Jafar was put on the throne because he was the eldest of the sheikh's blood and was powerful and calm. The agreement was almost final. However, the shifting of the sands of fate had only started. Omar has always been the most ambitious of the three brothers, because to his older brother's shadow, he was the youngest and most ignored. However, he had discovered early on that authority was not bestowed. They took it. Jafar now ruled as though it had always been his, sitting atop their father's throne. Rashid, the second-born, stood obediently by his side while the people applauded him and the nobles vowed allegiance. Omar, however, observed what the others missed. Jafar had become too accustomed. He had tightened his hold on the throne, and it was becoming increasingly obvious that power would not be shared. Not really, Omar refused to wait. Not the way Rashid had. Not while their father kept them waiting. Omar discovered Rashid standing by himself in the quiet palace hallways one evening under the crescent moon. Lo, the torches blazed. The icy, flickering light shone on the marble floors. His footsteps were silent on the stone as he walked toward his brother. What is the point of us sharing the throne? The weight of fate itself was in his voice, which was no more than a whisper. Rashid's forehead furrowed as he turned. Omar took a step forward, his eyes blazing with silent rage. His words, Jafar grows too comfortable. Al-Ramtha should belong to us alone. There was a pause between them. Rashid paused. Being the middle son, he was constantly caught between Omar's disobedience and Jafar's authority, between compliance and disobedience. Ambition fought a struggle against loyalty. Two figures walked through the palace's halls like wraiths that very night while it slept in sweet unknowing. The desert wind whispered of the impending betrayal as it brushed against the windows. Jafar slept in his quarters, breathing steadily and letting his chest rise and fall slowly. With golden candelabras, silk draperies, and the subtle aroma of myrrh permeating the air, the space was lavished with the wealth of a monarch. The brothers moved together, quiet, not visible, unforgiving. Omar retrieved the dagger, the identical blade that had sealed their blood bond under the eclipsed moon, from beneath Jafar's robes at the foot of his bed. The markings engraved on its metal shone dimly in the low light, as though the dagger itself was aware of the betrayal that was about to take place. Rashid paused once more. Omar, however, didn't. He slashed the sword across Jafar's throat with a quick, vicious blow. A sudden, piercing gasp, a chokehold. Never again would there be a gurgling breath. The dark stain of Jafar's blood spread like ink on parchment as it dripped onto the silken linens. After a single jerk, his body became motionless. There was silence in the room. Jafar's hazy, unfocused, yet somehow conscious eyes met Omar's as he let himself breathe. He grinned as well, a gentle smile, almost amused, knowing. He seemed hardly able to breathe, yet his voice was full with something neither of them could identify. The pact is not yours to break. Then the palace was filled with howling winds. Shadows stretched strangely across the walls of the chamber as the torch's flames flickered erratically. A low, guttural, ancient murmur twisted across the air. The smell of desert ruins and something far deeper accompanied it. Omar tensed. Rashid's throat tightened each breath. On the night of their pledge, the same wind had roared through the temple ruins. It was the same murmur that had heard their vow. It had finally arrived to gather. Rashid had inherited the throne of Al-Ramtha after Jafar's death. Omar, however, was not a patient man. He hadn't planned their father's downfall or shed his own brother's blood merely to stand in another person's shadow again. Rashid was taken by fate just as the city was starting to adapt to its new governance. It was a glass, a drink, a last breath, gentle and simple. Rashid's veins were now filled with the same poison that had killed their father. Before he could even comprehend what was occurring, his neck tightened, his vision became hazy, and his body sagged still in his opulent seat. There was no fighting, no opportunity to defend oneself. Omar's look was one of peaceful delight as he watched his brother's breath dwindle into oblivion while his hands were folded behind his back. He now had Al-Ramtha as his own. His slyness was spoken in the arid winds. While some referred to him as unstoppable, others as vicious, everyone bowed down. The nobles pledged allegiance. The populace complied. His brothers had been consumed by his desire, and now he was the sole ruler of Al-Ramtha. But victory is short-lived. His coronation night arrived, bringing with it an unnatural silence. The huge hall's air became heavy and thick. Wrong. Even though there was no wind, the large chandeliers above wobbled, their flames flickering and fading as though something invisible was stealing the room's light. Once warm and rich, the incense's aroma became bitter. The huge, inflexible walls appeared to enclose the space. Wearing the royal robes, Omar sat on the throne with a golden crown on his forehead. However, he did not bear the burden of victory. Then a voice spoke from the darkness. Low, rash, known. Omar, the agreement cannot be broken. The voice of Jafar, like a knife, the sound sliced through the stillness and curled up against his ear like a phantom whisper. Omar stopped. His chest tightened each breath. It seemed as though every living thing had been sucked up by the walls of the hall, which had just moments before been crowded with aristocrats and guards. With a start, he stood up, reaching for the dagger at his waist. As he turned, his eyes darting to every darkened corner, his heartbeat hammered against his ribs. Nothing, just shadows. Only the chill wind encircling him, an invisible hold, an entity he was unable to identify. However, he was aware. Yes, he was aware. The whisper that had carried their pledge through the desert sands, the wind that howled through the ruins the night they made their vow, had not forgotten. And now he was the target. The silence of the night was uncanny. No voices reverberated across the palace's great halls, and no wind moved the arid dunes. The flames of the torches fought against an invisible power as they burned low. Once vibrant and ambitious, the city of Al-Ramtha seems to hold its breath. Omar's chamber doors were locked from the inside when the guards arrived at daybreak. They knocked twice and got no response. They felt a chill creep into their bones. The sight within stopped them where they stood when the hefty wooden doors were wrenched open. Omar had passed away. His hand was tightly gripping the knife that had cemented the brother's promise as he lay on the marble floor. His garments were undamaged, and his face was unmarred by any wounds. There was a rictus of otherworldly dread that disfigured his face. His soulless eyes were wide and looking, not at the men who had entered his chamber or the walls, but at something outside that only he had seen. His lips parted in a silent scream, a nightmare that had attacked him during the night. Its last soul had been taken by the curse. Like wildfire, word of his passing swept throughout Al-Ramtha. People murmured about the oath that should never have been taken, about the three brothers and their blood-stained ambition, as well as the cost that was incurred. The throne was still vacant. It was not claimed by any heir. The once thriving, powerful metropolis started to deteriorate. Streets were deserted, trade slowed, and the magnificent palace, which had once been alive with music, feasts and voices fell silent. Al-Ramtha eventually collapsed, its name only whispered by those who remained terrified of the slain brothers' covenant. They referred to it as cursed. They referred to it as abandoned. In the busy marketplace of Al-Khamsa, far from the deteriorating city, where visitors congregated to exchange stories about faraway places, an elderly blind seer sat on a tattered mat and whispered her warnings to anybody who would listen. The weight of lost realities was in her voice, weak but unflinching. She said, "Wesham, watch out for the blood of the oath. Remember the sands. Additionally, the murmurs will never go away." One traveler sat motionless among the assembled mob. His fingers twitched as they hovered over the hilt of an old dagger at his waist, and he breathed shallowly. A dagger with inscriptions that have been forgotten. His chest roared with his heart, because he was Jafar's last surviving descendant. In a voice, low, raspy, and familiar, came through the wind that twisted through the marketplace, carried by the breath of the desert. The pact cannot be broken. He was the target of the gossip. Many kingdoms have been buried under the sands of time, yet some names will never be forgotten. Once a city of strength and a gem of the desert, Al-Ramtha is now reduced to a cemetery of stone and stillness. Once a place where kings feasted and spoke of conquest, the vast palace has fallen into ruin. Its powerful walls, which stood the test of time, are now in ruins as the changing dunes engulf them. No banners are in the air. Torches don't burn. There are no people in the hallways, only the wind. But no soul is brave enough to go in. The ruins are off limits to even the most seasoned tourists who have endured the vast, harsh desert. It's too quiet. There are too many shadows. They report that, as though the ground itself is unwilling to retake the city, the sands beneath the fallen throne have not changed. The wind, however, is the real warning. People who are dumb or unlucky enough to listen too intently and who hang around the ruins at night claim to hear voices, not the howl of the desert breeze or the shifting of old stones. 3 voices, whispering in the shadows. The pact cannot be broken. The whisper never goes away.